The second point I want to make before I actually start is a kind of disclaimer. So just so you know, I have framed this presentation voluntarily in a semi-provocative way to trigger some thought from your part. Even if we all know that obviously food systems are certainly much more nuanced and much more complicated than I'm going to paint it here. But again, without triggering reaction, we usually don't challenge ourselves, which I think, in fact, is a big part of what science should be about not taking things for granted and triggering thought-provoking discussion. So today my talk, as Christian said, will be on food system, and more specifically on the question of the political economy of food system. Next, please. So in that presentation, I will argue that food system transformation is not a technical or technological issue, and therefore that the solution is not to be found in the technological sector or even to be looked for there, but rather that the transformation of food system is essentially a social issue, and more specifically a governance and a political issue. So political economy is about who is controlling and benefiting from a particular process or a particular setting. In other terms, who are the winner and who are the loser of that process, and who could be blamed for it. Next, please. So in that presentation, I will basically make 3 points. The first of those points is that at present, the food system is locked in its current trajectory by a group of powerful actors, and those actors have some strong interest not to see the system changing too much, because they're currently making a lot of money out of it. The second point I'll make is that there's not enough political will amongst the other key actors, and here I'm mentioning essentially the governments and the consumers. So not enough political will to organize themselves and align their own action to kind of counterbalance those powerful actors that I was mentioning earlier, and to kind of tilt the system toward more sustainable trajectories. And then third point I'll make in this presentation is, contrary to what many claim or assume or hope, technological innovation is, as it works now, is not the game changer that is necessary to transform food system. Next, please. So at least if there's one thing that people agree on, is that our food systems are not working properly. They're not in great shape. And here I use the quote, one quote by the EAT Lancet report, which on here I quote, call for nothing less than a great transformation. Note, however, that the EAT Lancet report was not the first to call for such transformation. In fact, several other panel of experts prior to that EAT Lancet report had already concluded the same thing. Our system is not sustainable, and we need to change something. For me, the interesting question, however, is not what needs to change, but how we're going to do it. Next, please. So, when we talk about food system transformation, one of the very first things to do is obviously to define and clarify what we mean by transformation. So transformation in the common sense, the one that we usually use in our day-to-day life, means radical change, often taking place at the level of the structure of the system. So in case of food system, it's important to acknowledge that food system have been transforming. In fact, they have never stopped transforming. And in the recent past, one famous example has been the supermarketization of food system that took place in Latin America, Africa, and Asia in the last 30 years. But there are plenty of examples in the long history of food systems, so including the Green Revolution, of course, but also the shift toward monoculture that has been observed or characterized the agriculture since the middle of last century, or the westernization of the diet that has been observed in Asia in the last 30 to 30 years, or the widespread use of GMO all over the world. And next, please. Now, perhaps the next big transformation is one that has actually already started with the recent COVID in particular, which is the online shopping. The point being that in its current conventional sense, transformation in food system refer to changes that have been drastic, rapid, that have generally affected the entire structure or the functioning of the system, but, and that's the important point here, did not necessarily lead to positive outcomes. Next, please. Now, more recently, the term transformation started to be used in a slightly different way in particular by the academic literature. This time people started to attach a normative or even sometimes a prescriptive dimension to it. And then understood with that normative element, transformation refers not just to drastic or rapid changes, but to deliberate and tended changes that go in one desirable and hopefully positive direction, and that are expected to lead to a better system, possibly towards sustainability. And here I'm using two quotes by two groups of scholars, where I highlighted in red the positive aspect that transformation are now expected to bring. So the first quote by Jessica Bliff on her colleagues is one that presents transformation, and here I quote as inherently good and define what is legitimate and justifiable to achieve sustainability. And the second quote tells us that transformation are expected to lead us toward, and I quote again, a coherent, just, and well integrated and stable food system. Next, please. So in sum, what we have was first, the term transformation was used in the literature in a conventional descriptive sense, where transformation referred to the scale or the nature of the change. Within that interpretation, technological innovation is usually seen or presented as what drove the change, while those innovations are themselves driven by the market dynamics, and in particular profit, which means that at the end, those innovations are what I call random innovation, sometimes leading to good outcomes, and sometimes leading to not so good outcomes, at least from a sustainability or a human health perspective. And the picture that you see on the left is, I think, a good example of that. Next, please. So we pass from that initial conventional interpretation of transformation to a new interpretation where this time transformation of food system is associated to a normative dimension, as I was mentioning. The process is not random anymore, but instead it's intended, deliberate, and wanted. The engine of that change might still be technological innovation, but it's not clear, or at least not clear to me, since, as I was just saying, innovation by themselves are driven by profit, not by sustainability. And finally, in that new interpretation of the term transformation, we are expected to observe a clear directionality with the idea that leads us toward more sustainability. Now, the $1 million question, of course, is how do we pass from a random transformation to a normative transformation? So the main hypothesis of this presentation is that passing from the current random type of transformation to a more normative transformation is currently hampered by the presence of barriers and resistance that prevent the system from evolving and from being redirected toward the type of normative changes that we need for normative transformation to happen. Next, please. So the first of those transformations is the fact that food systems are controlled and locked by powerful actors, what is usually called the big food in the literature, who have very strong financial interest to maintain the food system in its current trajectory. Next, please. So as probably some of you know already, the agri-food system is one of the most concentrated sector of the world economy. And the figure here shows that from the very upstream part of the system, with seeds, agri-chemical, fertilizer, all the way down to the retail industry on the supermarket, the food system is controlled by the very few companies. What you may also need to know, however, is that in the economic literature, we consider that when more than 40% of the sector is controlled by 4 companies or less, there is no longer effective competition. And when more than 60% of the sector is controlled by 4 companies or less, we are in what we call an oligopolistic situation. In other terms, in presence of cartel. Next, please. Now, what are the implications of that huge concentration of power and resources in the hand of very few powerful actors? Well, the first implication is the fact that those resources allow those companies to set the term of the debate and to shape policies through first lobbying, of course, what is also called the power of influence, but also simply through the scale effect. Some of those companies are so big or they control so much of the market that if or when they decide to change some of their internal commercial strategy, this effectively affects the entire sector and therefore a lot of actors, sometimes the whole continent. Now, the second way big food influence the process is through the use of the research and development, or R&D. So in theory, R&D is expected to boost innovation. In reality, what happens is that those actors use their own R&D to maintain their control over the market. In fact, analysis by the US Federal Trade Commission have shown that there is actually a negative correlation between the level of concentration of a sector and the level of innovation in that sector. In other terms, the bigger the concentration, the lower the innovation. And this is related to what is called defensive research and development, which happen when companies use their own resources to protect their own existing product and investment instead of developing new products. And obviously, the bigger the company, the more resources and the bigger the capacity they have to protect their own interests against newcomers. So what I'm arguing here is that altogether, those different processes are very powerful barriers that allow the big food to keep control on the food system and prevent the transformation from happening. Next, please. The second barrier to change is the existence of deeply rooted divergences in the objective and the values between various key players. And here I'm thinking more specifically the governments and the consumers of food system. And to illustrate that point, I will use the case of red meat. Next, please. So for the red meat, we all know what it will take to stay within the planetary boundary, right? It will require a more or less greater than 50% reduction in the production and consumption of red meat at the global level. Yet, what do we see? Next, please. At the present time, and with the exception of Africa and South Asia, the consumption of meat exceeds by between 300 and 600% the reference diet intake, which was suggested by the Lancet report. And projection indicate that, listen, 3 billion people, half of the planet, is expected to continue increase their consumption of meat in the next 20 years. And therefore, boosted by that growth in demand, production of red meat is also projected to increase in aggregate by another 19 million tons in the next 10 years, reaching almost 350 million tons by 2030. Now, although the majority of that increase in production will take place in low and middle income countries, in fact, 3 countries will contribute the vast majority of that increase: China and Brazil amongst the emerging economy, and the US. Next, please. Now, what is important to know is that in those free countries, and in many other, of course, the government is still actively supporting the meat industry. So in the US, for instance, Tyson and Smithfield, which are two of the largest actors of the sector, have in the past received in aggregate more than $570 million of subsidies every year between 1997 and 2005. In China, the pork industry has been receiving about $22 billion per year, which represents about $47 per pig. And in Brazil, the federal government is a shareholder of GBS, which is the world's largest meat producer. In sum, what that slide shows is that while we knew that the private sector is part of the problem, in reality, consumers, by their demand, and government, by their policy and subsidies, also have their share of responsibility in creating or maintaining the problem. Next, please. The third main barrier to normative transformation is not the fact that it's not a barrier to change in itself, but a barrier to sustainable change. And I'm arguing that this is related to the way innovation and technology operate. So let me elaborate a little bit on that point. So in the literature, there's currently a growing narrative about the potential role that technological innovation could play or is expected to play in achieving sustainable change. And this narrative is found in the international organization community. So for instance, it was the main focus of the 2021 UN Food System Summit, where innovation had been presented as the game changer. And here on the right-hand side, you have another example of that narrative with the front page of the World Economic Forum report, which was published also during the UNFSS year, which presents technological innovation as the accelerator of change. But that discourse is also present in the academic literature, with a growing number of articles which also present technological innovation as the solution to transform food system. And here I'm just citing Chris Barrett's recent report. And of course, the private sector is also presenting itself as the way to go. Next, please. For instance, McDonald's teamed up recently with a startup called Beyond Meat to produce some plant-based hamburger. Next, please. What I'm arguing, however, is that this narrative is misleading and ill-grounded. And the proof of that statement is the very fact that the unsustainability of our food system as we observe it today is in fact the result of those past innovations, like the one you can see on the picture. So why would innovation, which led us to the current mess we are right here now, should then suddenly, magically lead us to sustainability? And the reason why the magic is not going to happen is simply because the driver of innovation, what ensures the survival of an innovation today, is not related to whether it generates sustainability, but whether it's economically viable and whether it generates profit. Next, please. For illustration, this is the 2021 50 most innovative company in the world according to the World Economic Forum. In those names, do you see any which would be known to be specifically targeting sustainability as their business model? Well, perhaps with the exception of Tesla, I don't. Next, please. Oh, and by the way, so the one highlighted in red are the ones that are directly involved in food system. Which one are there? Walmart? No, please go back to, no, you're going too fast. Yes, stay here. So who are there? Walmart, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Bayer. I think it's fair to say that none of those big food transnational corporations are viewed as the world leaders in sustainable or healthy food product, right? On the contrary. Yet they are presented by the World Economic Forum as some of the most innovative companies in the world. I think what this shows is the underlying mental model of the World Economic Forum. The scary thing, of course, that the World Economic Forum was the institution leading the UNFSS behind the scene. Next, please. So the third reasons why I'm highly skeptical that innovation is the way to achieve sustainability is because sustainability is not just about environmental sustainability. Sustainability is also about social equity, right? Yet in that domain as well, technological innovation is not doing well either. In fact, innovation has been well documented to increase the inequality or the inequality gap as opposed to reduce it. Let me provide you with some facts here. On the right hand side of the slide, you have what is called the readiness index, which is calculated every 2 years, I think, by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, where readiness is defined as the capacities of countries to adapt, and use new technology. So in other terms, the readiness index gives an idea of how countries are able to build and rely on new technology for their development. Now, the red line, the red circle that you see around the Earth here is actually the world average in that readiness index. What do you observe is that a large number of South and Latin America in yellow on the left-hand side, and about half of the Asia in blue, and almost the entire African continent in that pinky red color at the bottom, are below the average value. This means that, as I was pointing out earlier, data show that innovation contributes to perpetuate or possibly even to deepen further inequality, not to reduce it. So I'm asking you, in those conditions, how can it be presented as the way to solve our food system sustainability problem when sustainability also includes social or equity dimension? Next, please. So for the discussion, there's obviously many points that I didn't cover in those first 20 minutes of the presentation, but that also need to be considered. So several of them are listed here. First, an important point to keep constantly in mind is that although they are part of the private sector, at the present time, the small actors are generally not well represented in much countries at the national level. So when we talk about the private sector as one unified actors, we actually contributing to further the issues by overlooking a huge part of the problem. Second, and building on that first point, is the fact that the vast majority of the people involved in food system activities in low and middle income countries are working in the informal sector, and as such have very little visibility and more often than not are marginalized or even discriminated often by public policy makers. Next, please. Sometimes, or something I just mentioned in passing now, which is the social dimension of sustainability. The fact that sustainability is not just measured in terms of environmental impact of food system, but also in terms of social justice. And fourth, the potential critical role of consumers, and the fact that while consumers are very often presented as a potential positive drivers, or even as a solution to fix the problem, they are also very often supporting or creating negative trends. And we just saw earlier the figures regarding the increase in demand of red meat, and as such are part of the problem. Next, please. So what would it take to have this great transformation that the Eat-Lancet Commission and so many scholars or experts are calling on? Well, I hope that I managed to show that there are at least three main conditions that need to be fulfilled for that great transformation to happen. Next, please. The first is to address that issue of sustainability of technological innovation. Since innovation will always be driven by profit, the only way we can ensure that the outcomes that emerge from those innovations are not just random, but contribute more systematically and more consistently to a deliberate change towards sustainability, the only way to do that would be to align the drivers, which is profit, with sustainability objective. In other terms, we will allow profit to happen only when the innovation contributes to sustainability. And this could be done by taxing, for instance, any new food system product that is not sustainable. So that, next please, that type of innovation never again can reach the market. Next, please. The second condition to ensure that the great transformation takes place would be to make government accountable for the action, and in particular the decision which goes against the sustainability of food system. At the present time, more than 80% of the subsidies relate to food system, 80% of the subsidies that are directed to food system goes to cereals, meat, and dairy products. Only 2% goes to support legumes and nuts, and less than 1% goes to support vegetables and fruits. That need to be reversed. And the only way this can happen is by making government accountable, and possibly maybe expose them to civil lawsuits brought by citizen or organization to force those governments to change their policy and action around food system, the same way that is currently done for climate change. Next, please. Now, the main condition, I think the last main condition for great transformation to happen is, I think, the most challenging one. Is the one that's the one when we tackle consumer behavior, acknowledging that food is culturally and socially embedded in very deep layer of our society and civilization, and that again, for the great transformation to happen, we're talking about a global shift in diet, not just few vegan consumers in high-income countries, but also, and this is where it becomes politically tricky, also citizens in lower-income countries. In that respect, I think there's currently some inconsistency in the way sustainability is currently defined, because culturally acceptable, which is part of the definition proposed in particular by the UN, culturally acceptable is not necessarily the same than sustainable or healthy. Next, please. And I think I reached the end of this presentation. Thank you for your attention.